imaging, right? It plots it on the screen, basically, if you want to think of it that way. All right. And so then the scan converter, of course, sends the information. The information goes to the display where we see it. After it goes to the display, some of the information can be stored for later viewing as either films. Maybe it puts it on a PAX storage system. And sometimes you'll see it go in as a videotape. They even do that in some cases. So this is basically the flow of information through the ultrasound machine. All right, we've already covered this, but you guys, are you familiar with it? Do you feel like you understand it? Did anyone wake up after lunch? Just yes, no, you got it, you don't got it? All right. Okay. So scan converter, again, turns A mode into B mode, stores the images into memory. What did we call everything that happens before the scan converter? Pre-processing. What do we call everything that happens after the scan converter? Post-processing. All right, very good. With the newer machines, just so you're aware of this, almost everything is now post-processing. It tends to store it all into memory, and then it converts it into whatever it needs, like making the A mode signal. Okay, so frame rates, let's talk just a minute about how we create a frame. Our frame rate is always limited by the amount of time it takes to create a frame. So if it takes us a week and a half to create a frame, our frame rate is going to be really, really low. The frame period is the amount of time to create a single frame, and it is the time it takes to image 1 centimeter times the depth in centimeters times the number of scan lines. So Jessica, that's what we did right before class. Yeah. Okay. The frame rate is 1 divided by the frame period. Okay? Remember, your rate, your frequency, the frame rate is a frequency, is always the reciprocal of the period. All right? So the frame rate is the reciprocal of the period, so you just take 1, divide it by the frame period, you get the frame rate. So in the example we had earlier, the frame period was 15.6 milliseconds. This was from your homework. So what would be the frame rate for this? Right, 1 over 15.6, which equals 0.064, and this was in millihertz, so milli in the bottom goes to what in the top, kilohertz?
Right. Kilo.
Yeah, okay. So, and I should put the milliseconds up here just so we know where I got that kilohertz from. All right. So this is my frame rate. This is my frame period. Okay. So the more lines you have, the lower your frame rate. The more depth you have, the lower your frame rate. The higher your frame period, the lower your frame rate. Okay? All right, so those are frame rates. So beam width, this is probably the only part of chapter, what chapter are we on here? 6, 7? Was it real-time imaging? No. Image formation. Yeah, so this is coming out of chapter 7. And a little bit from earlier chapters. Beam width, and if you recall from our previous discussion, our beam width, if we have a crystal here The beam width is the signal, and it changes with depth, right? Lateral resolution is related to beam width. Okay, so it changes with depth, so you can't always know exactly what your lateral resolution is. In sector images, if we draw a sector up here like this, then every time we send out a pulse, we kind of angle it as it goes out. And you can see on the PowerPoint, we send out one like this, then we send out another one here, and we send out another one here, we send out another one here, and we send out one here. So objects that are in the near field have lots and lots of scan lines that go through them. So we get really good resolution in the near field in a sector picture. Unfortunately, if we have an object in the far field that happens to fall in between these lines as they're spreading out, we may not see that. Okay? So our resolution in the far field is decreased. Low resolution in the far field. Okay? High resolution in the near field. All right? And you can see why. If this same object is up here, it's probably going to get hit by 3 different scan lines. Okay, same size object. Down here, the scan lines just happen to be farther apart because they're radiating out away from each other. Okay? So again, poor resolution, good resolution. All right? All right. If we have a linear array probe, how is the resolution going to change from near to far? So in this case, we've got our image is square because it's a linear probe. All right. And our scan lines are coming down like this. Okay? We don't have that spreading effect in a linear array probe, so the resolution is similar in the near field and the far field, with the exception that our beam width itself is changing. Okay?
I thought that sound waves spread no matter what.
They do spread after they get to the focus. Yeah, so wherever your focus is will be where you have your best resolution. And then they spread out, but you don't have this same effect that you get with a sector probe. Okay? In this case, you're actually directing it to spread out. And so your images will have different resolution in the... Yeah, you can use a narrow window and see a larger area, whereas the linear, you're using a big wide window, but you at least don't have this effect where the beam, you're actually directing it to spread out. Okay? All right. Okay. And again, just to recap, lateral resolution is the ability to resolve 2 objects side by side, and it does change with depth because both our beam shape itself is changing, and if we're using a probe that spreads out the beam, that will also have an effect on it. All right, let's introduce a new term, temporal resolution. And it's just simply the ability to resolve objects in real time. Okay? It takes out that jerkiness in the imaging. So if you've ever scanned something where you've had a lot of bells and whistles on the machine and it makes the image real slow, that's poor temporal resolution. It means that the frame itself, the frame rate is really low, and you're getting a poor image because of that. Okay. Generally, frame rates, you want them in about the 15 frames per second. That's usually a good rate. Frame periods, you like to see less than 66 milliseconds per frame. All right. Okay, so let's review Chapter 7 real quick. It's taken us 15 minutes to get through all of Chapter 7, so that's really good. There's not a lot in there. There's really not. More scan lines, low frame rate. Fewer scan lines, high frame rate. Shallow depth, high frame rate. Deep depth, low frame rate. Lateral resolution improves with smaller scan lines. So if we can pack in a few extra scan lines here, we're going to get better lateral resolution. Okay, so I've just packed in a whole bunch more scan lines. So what did that do to my frame rate? Jennifer? What would that do to my frame rate by adding more scan lines? Actually, it will increase the amount of time it takes to create the image or the frame period, but it will decrease the frame rate. Okay? So the rate, how often I can refresh this frame, will actually decrease as I add more scan lines. So more scan lines will lower my frame rate. All right. So any questions about Chapter 7? We've just covered. It's pretty simple stuff. All right. Yeah, that's Chapter 8, and we're getting right to that right now. Sounds like you're ready. Okay. Now, Chapter 7, there wasn't a lot of stuff in. Chapter 8 actually has a ton of stuff. So we're going to go through this at a slightly slower pace. Homework is due tomorrow for Chapter 8, yes. Okay, so let's just briefly review mechanical scanners. These are single crystal devices. So we have one crystal that sends out one pulse. That's just terrible. The whiteboard just isn't cleaning at all today. All right. So if we have our single crystal, remember, it'll send out a pulse of sound that will form some kind of a shape where in our scan line, we call this area in front of the focus is the near zone. The area beyond the focus is and the name for this is the Fresnel, and the name for this is Fraunhofer. Right, okay. So we know what a single scan line, the shape of the beam is. Okay, and all these crystals do, if I take my crystal and I aim it this way and I send out a sound beam, and then I aim it this way and I send out a sound beam, or I aim it this way. So if I put it on a little device that'll wobble it back and forth, I can send out sound beams, and I get a picture that looks like a sector, right? So here is my sector scan, and this is how we create the sector scans with a single crystal, is we just keep moving it back and forth and taking individual scan lines across the field of interest. All right. Another way to do it, sometimes they'll take this, instead of wobbling it back and forth, they'll put it on a wheel like that, and then they'll just spin the wheel around. Okay, and every time it goes around, they'll start sending out pulses, and you get the same effect. All right, so there's not a lot of difference in whether you're wobbling it back and forth or rotating it around in circles. You still end up with pretty much a sector image when you're doing this. So the crystal either wobbles back and forth, and if you plug in the sono line in there, you can pick up one of the probes that are not the linear ones, of course, and you can actually feel it wobbling as it's working. In these, the scan lines, of course, are going to be greater near the transducer. We just talked about that. In the far field, you have limited resolution, both because the beam is spreading out and we're getting that as the beam spreads out, I want to say diffuses, but it, what's the word that, diverges, yeah. We get divergence in the far field, so we lose our lateral resolution, and we're hitting fewer points with the far field, with the image in the far field, the sound beam in the far field, so we get poor resolution because of that. So couple of limitations with these. Otherwise, they're not too bad of probes. You really get pretty clear images because there's not a lot of electronics to give you noise, so they work pretty good for that. So that's the mechanical scanner. Any ideas why we don't use these anymore? When you think about that, is the primary reason. Moving parts, it tends to break down. They can become very expensive to fix. They're fairly cheap to make, but they break down a lot. That's a big reason right there. The other reasons are that we cannot change the focus. It's a single crystal. The only way to change the focus is to actually go in there and reshape the lens or add a lens, focusing lens on it. So you can either reshape the crystal or add a lens. These are not things you're going to be doing in your ultrasound lab, though. So it has a fixed focal spot. All right. And again, the pattern that you're going to look at is from the transducer straight out and back. Okay. And that's not useful for a lot of things that we're going to be using transducers for today. We'll get into those. Okay. So there are some limitations. So what the manufacturers have done is they came up with linear array probes, and these are groups of crystals lined up and fired electronically. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually drop my crystal down here, and I'm going to, instead of having one big crystal, I'm going to make a transducer out of a whole bunch of little crystals. All right. All right, so now we have a whole bunch of little crystals. And with a sequential array probe, and these are also the type of linear array probes we have on that old sono line in there, you end up seeing these little lines in between the image And that is because what it does is it sends out an electronic signal to the first. I'm just going to show you how I draw electronic signals coming down a wire. Okay, so this is my little voltage spike coming down and hitting the first crystal. And then this crystal sends out a little sound beam. And as you can see, it hits some structures and sometimes it doesn't, and then it goes all the way down and comes back. Makes sense. So that's what we get. We send out a sound beam, it goes down, it comes back. After that, we go to the next one. We hit it with a little voltage. It does the same thing. And we do that all the way down the line until we hit the last one with a voltage in sequence. So this is a sequential array transducer, linear array transducer with sequential firing. You start at this end and you move down to that end. All right, pretty simple, really simple. You get funky pictures like this. Everything goes down straight, everything comes back straight, and you end up with little lines in it. Okay. So this baby was probably born in 1980, right around there, 78 to 80, with this type of transducer. You can pretty much label this. Yes, it could be somebody in this room. Probably. All right, so that's the sequential array. Okay, we're all good on that one? All right. Crystals fire from one end to the other in sequence. The lines go straight. Can't be any easier. Before we move on to any other type of array probe, I want to talk to you about what Huygens principle is. And Christian Huygens was a Dutch feller who argued with Isaac Newton about optics and lost out on the greatest scientist of all time to Newton because they were contemporaries. That's really not important, is it? What Huygens found, though, was that if you have a bunch of little waves all working together or moving together, it is essentially equivalent of having one big wave. Okay, that's Huygens' principle. So we call these little wavelets, and a bunch of little wavelets act together as one big wave. That's Huygens' principle.
So how come there were lines in
Because those were sequential. They didn't act together, they were one at a time.
it? Oh, okay.
Okay? Now we're going to be firing them off at different times. And so at the same time, at similar times, we're going to fire them off so that they can work together. All right? So now imagine if I have a single crystal transducer, if I want to set my focus in the near field, what do I do in order to make the focus up close to the crystal? Yeah, you turn your knob. But we're talking about a single crystal. I'm the manufacturer, and I want this to focus very close to the skin. I could use a curved lens, correct? Or I could use a narrow diameter, right? Now, don't confuse thin with narrow diameter. So if I have a narrow diameter, okay, remember, it's going to send out a wave, and it's very quickly going to focus, and then it's going to diverge, right? And remember, this distance here between the focus and the crystal is called the near zone length, right? Remember that? And it is related to the frequency times the diameter squared, right? Okay, and then that's over 6 if you want a fairly close estimate. But just remember the diameter squared. So now we want to move this near zone length deeper because we're dealing with a McBurger patient, all right? So we do that by simply increasing the size, the diameter of the crystal. And now we get a deep focal zone, and it takes a long time before it begins to diverge, right? So now by increasing our diameter, we've increased our near zone length, right? Okay. Okay, now this one has really good lateral resolution for about 1 centimeter. This one has mediocre lateral resolution, but for many centimeters. So it's kind of a trade-off there, whether we want really good superficial structures or we want deeper structures, because we had to make our beam wider, but this one starts widening out quicker. All right, so we know that we can control the focal zone depth by controlling the diameter of the crystal. Now let's get back to our phased array probes. And let's take this off of here. Okay. And what I want to do is I want to have a probe that focuses shallow, medium, and deep. All right? So how am I going to get a shallow focus? I'm going to decrease the diameter. So exactly. I'm just going to fire a couple of crystals at a time. So we're going to fire these two in the center. All right? And we get two little wavelets that act together as one wave. And they're going to come down and they're going to focus and then they're going to diverge. All right? You see how that works? Now, how do I get a medium? Exactly. I'm going to fire off more. So let's see.
Do you fire them at the same time?
I can.
Is it usually done that way?
Okay. So
It'll wait and listen for the near one, and then it'll strike them again.
yeah. If we're doing this in one image, we'll fire off this one. It'll wait, and then once the sound dissipates, it'll send off another one now. And this one will be a little bit bigger, and it's going to come down, focus, and diverge, right? Because it's all going to act as one wave, a little bit bigger wave, and then it's going to focus and start diverging at some other point. So now we've got a focal zone here and a focal zone up here. Okay, now how do we get the deep focal zone? We fire off more, don't we? Okay, so we come down here. Okay, and this time we're going to fire off a whole bunch of little wavelets. They're going to act as one big wave. The big wave is going to focus very deep but be very wide. And so now we've got a focal zone down here. Okay. Can we adjust how we fire these? Yeah. So we'll get to that. We'll talk about that. But you see how we can change our diameter of our crystal by firing off different numbers of crystals. Our diameter of our wave by firing off different numbers of crystals. Yeah, this is a phased array transducer. This particular type that we're talking about, and right now we're just saying that we're firing it all at once, whatever size crystal diameter we want, we're going to fire off those little crystals. What do you call a little crystal? Crystallets? And make wavelets. Yeah, whatever. This would be the segmental. If you read your book, this is the segmental array transducer. Okay? We can fire off different segments, different numbers of crystals at a time, crystallets, and form different size waves. Are we still making sense here?
Yes.
All right. So with a segmental, we have the ability to fire off different size waves and change our focus electronically. All right. So sequential, we start at one end, we go to the other, we fire them off one at a time. Segmentally, we fire them off in groups, changing the diameter depending on where we want the focus to be. And it works because of this Huygens principle, where we can add up the little wavelets to make big waves. All right. So the question I kept hearing time and again is, do you fire them off at the same time? Well, sort of. You can, but you don't have to. And if you don't have to, you've got what's called a phased array probe. Okay, so phased array, I mentioned the segmental. In the segmental, the crystal aperture, the aperture means diameter, right? Crystal aperture can be electronically selected. So if you can change your aperture, you can change your focus. All right, so for a few small crystals, we can have shallow depth. With many crystals, we can have deep depth focusing. We good there? All right. Now, if we look at a true phased array probe, this involves electronic timing of how we fire off those little wavelets. All right? So if I send my electric pulse to this guy first, all right, and we get a little wavelet from him, and then I wait just that little bit of a time, and I send off an electric pulse to this guy, this one will travel some distance into the body before this one fires. All right. Now I wait a little bit longer, and I fire off the next one. All right. Now this one travels a little farther. This one has traveled some distance, and now this one fires. Okay. Let's fire off one more at a little bit later time. This one's still going into the body. This one now comes down a little bit. This one has gone a little ways. And now this one fires. All right? Now let's not fire anymore for a couple of microseconds. We're going to let these travel down into the body just so we can describe what they're doing a little easier. It looks like that, okay? And if you use Huygens principle now, you can draw what this wave is doing. It's a wave like that, all right? Okay, so now we have a wave at an angle, okay? Waves like to travel in the direction of their wavefront. So here is the wavefront. This wave is actually going to travel in that direction. So what we've done is we fired off some little wavelets. They make a big wave, and that wave is now steered in a particular direction.
That's all I guess.
Well, it starts out, this one started out going straight. All the little wavelets start out going straight, but the wave front that they create together, they all work together, actually moves in a direction because of Huygens principle, and it says that little wavelets working together can make big waves. And because they were fired in this sequence, okay, they were phased when they were fired, it means that they're going to move in a direction. So what's the purpose? That's a great question. Why would they do this? All right. If I can electronically do this, here's what can happen. I can take my probe, and my first wave that I send off, I can electronically tell it to go out this way. My next one, I can tell it to go this way. And then my next one this way. This is steering. And at the end of the day, what I've created here is a sector scan out of a totally electronic probe. This is what they call the vector probe, if you want the name, or sector, electronic phased array sector probe. Okay. But the idea is that I can change the direction that my scan beam is going, my scan line is going electronically. Okay. Yeah, right. Like the little 3-vector one on the Sequoia in there. Yeah, that's exactly what this is. So now we get the same effect as we had with the mechanical wobbler probe, but we've done it electronically. And we've taken out all those moving parts that break down. Okay? So no longer do we have a probe that breaks down mechanically. We have a probe that is much more expensive to make and breaks when you drop it. Okay? But that's better, right? Okay, so the whole idea here was that now we can steer our probe with these little wavelets from Huygens principle. And so you can see in this picture on the PowerPoint how we use little wavelets, and as they propagate out. So this one was fired first, comes down, and it spreads out as it fires, and this whole wavefront is going to be moving this way. All right. So you can look at a wavefront, you can tell how the electronic firing occurred, or you can look at the electronic firing like this, and you can tell how the wavefront's going to be shaped. All right. So now, this is electronic focusing with using the timing. We'll get into that. So there's a couple ways we can focus. One of them we talked about was changing the aperture. All right, and then we can also focus changing the sequence of the pulses. All right, we haven't got to that quite yet.
So the aperture is set by the manufacturer, though, right?
Not in these electronic ones. We can decide what our aperture is. We can fire off 4 crystals. We could fire off 8 crystals. We could fire off 12 crystals. We could fire off 256 if we have that many.
You give us consent. I don't really understand. Again, like what you said, why would you want to steer it in a direction or something?
Why do you want to steer it?
Or how would you know that you want to steer it?
Okay, okay. I want to steer it because I want to create an image. Now remember, I've got a narrow probe. I don't want to have to move that probe everywhere and just see, I don't want to see this on my screen, okay? Where my gallbladder is a structure that's like that, okay? All I would see then is this little piece of the gallbladder here. What I want to see is a big section of it. Okay, so I want to see lots of the body. So I've got a narrow probe, but I want to see a bunch. So my reasoning for doing this is so that I can create that sector scan. Okay, I can use many scan lines, electronically steer them out this way, and electronically steer them out this way and electronically steer them down so that I can create a picture that is big. I want to see more of the body on my image. Okay, so that's why I'm doing the steering.
So what do you do on the machine to make it steer?
This is just how the
how it works.
picture naturally occurs.
So that's, you can open up the box, right?
On some machines, yeah, you can open up your box. If you take a, let me go get an example of the probe. So this probe is a vector probe. It's going to give you a sector image like this, okay? Even though it's real narrow, all right? So you don't want your image to be just, like that. You want this big image with this. And that's what the electronic steering allows you to do. There's no moving parts in here, but it fans out and gives you a big picture with the little bitty probe.
So it's not like I see a structure on the left, I can steer more beams to the left to see it better.
Not really. You pretty much it's fixed with these. Yeah. Some probes can do that a little bit, and I can show you in the lab on the GE using a linear array probe. We can do that. We can steer it right or left. But for the most part, these sector probes just go out straight. All right. And so we've talked about how we can angle the scan line and change the shape of our image. Okay. We can change the number of crystals we fire at a time, changing the focal depth by changing literally the diameter of the crystal. All right?
So then we have control using over crystals?
Yes. By selecting where you want your focal depth, you're telling it how many crystals you want to utilize. Yes. You don't have to say, I want 56 crystals. All right? You just say, I want the focal depth here, and it picks the number of crystals that are appropriate for that focal depth.
But then it also changes the direction of the
Mhm. Yeah, it does that automatically. It takes care of it. All right?
So when you're doing vascular stuff, I've seen them choose like one focal zone or 2 to 5.
The number of
Yeah.
Like the face.
Yeah. Anytime you have multiple focal zones on your screen, you're using a phased array transducer of some kind. Yeah. Absolutely. All right. That was kind of we've got about halfway through chapter 8. That's some heavy stuff in there. So we're going to go over that again tomorrow. We're going to take it tomorrow, and we're going to talk about phased array scanning, not just to make sector images, but as you guys were alluding to, steering for your Doppler, and as this shows, we can actually focus it using the electronic pulses. So we don't have to, we're not just limited to focusing with aperture, we can also focus it with timing. All right, so we're going to get into that tomorrow. Tomorrow your homework for chapter 8 is due. That should be it. Any questions today on what we've covered? I would say just plug it in, go take a look at it. Go plug into that machine, check it out, see what you think of the image. If you're scanning between ribs, it actually can be really nice.
That's a Doppler score, right?
This is a great probe for scanning between ribs. Yes, it is.